And then there's Operation Gothic Serpent, which is heading into Somalia. Became known as the Battle of Mogadishu. A lot of your book, of course, and rightfully so, is focused on that mission. I want to dive into that for a bit because that's the one. I mean, your situation in the Battle of Mogadishu took you out of running in obscurity in terms of your personal name and thrust you into the eyes of the entire world. And I remember that. I remember when that happened. It was amazing to see it. But for those who don't recall, Operation Gothic Serpent, the intro into Mogadishu for the United States actually started under George H.W. Bush.
Correct.
But it transitioned in early '93 when Clinton took office.
Correct.
So you were there during Clinton's era, correct?
Yes.
All right. So Clinton took office in January '93. Task Force Ranger is the name of the U.S. presence, I guess, at the airfield there. And then in October, was it October 3rd, I think? October 3rd, '93, launched what many people just refer to as Black Hawk Down because that's the book and the movie. And I guess code word Irene was what launched the mission, right?
It was.
Which my secretary downstairs at the law firm, her name is Irene. I told
really?
her one day, I said, I don't know if you're aware of the use of your name in modern pop culture. And she went, I've never heard that. So anyway.
And actually, that's my character that says it in the movie.
That is your character. Yeah. And I want to talk about the movie and all that too at some point, just to get your thoughts on it. But Rangers have the mission of going in and securing some high-value targets, or securing the scene so that Delta can secure the high-value targets. You're part of the flight in. Who were you bringing in, by the way?
So I was the flight lead, which means I'm responsible for my whole flight of aircraft of the Ranger blocking force. So it's basically split into two pieces. We had the assault force, which is where the Delta guys are. They're primarily on little birds. Yeah. And they're going to go in first because they want the element of surprise. They want to be, busting doors down before, with limited amount of time to react, right? If you put the blocking force in first, then you bring the assault force in, the bad guys have a little bit more time to react. So they're going in first. We're right behind them. So as soon as their birds pull out, we're moving in, and I had 4 Blackhawks that made up the blocking force, plus 2 spare attack little birds, plus the search and rescue bird. So we're all coming in together on the second wave, basically. And we just set up a box. I mean, all they want is put a Ranger platoon on each corner, and the purpose is twofold. One, keep more bad guys from getting in, and then obviously we call them leakers, keeping the people you're after from getting out. And that all went pretty smoothly, even though we'd done it 6 times before. This was the 7th mission.
Right.
And, we had tremendous success. We had captured, I think, 27 people on a list of 50, taken no casualties of any significance. We didn't lose any birds. I mean, it was all going pretty well. There were 3-day missions and 3-night missions leading up to that. And this 7th mission is a day mission, which created some risk factors that we knew about, but, not my call.
Part of the job.
But yeah, the commander makes the call.
Right.
They're within tolerance, I guess you could say, and when we go, and then all hell broke loose.
Yeah, it got crazy on the ground pretty quick, didn't it?
It did.
I know we had one Ranger injured on the fast rope end, and that created a scene. And then I guess the all call went out, and it seemed like everybody in Mogadishu had an AK-47, and they all ran to the scene.
And that was their strategy, which we found out later. They actually had set up a system where once they knew where we were hitting the target, and again, they learned this over time, right? When I talk about this, I try to compare it to sports, right? If you keep running the same play, the defense is going to adapt to that play, right? They understand, okay, this formation means this is what they're going to do, so here's how we counter that. It works the same way in the military. And so having done it 6 times, they obviously understood, okay, the helicopters will go to a target. That's where, they're going to put people on the ground. They're going to try to apprehend folks. If we can pin them in there, then, we might have some chance of
Plus, they were blocking roads, so the ground convoy was having trouble.
Yep. So we found out after that was their strategy. Once they knew where the target was, they were all going to close on it, and it worked pretty well, actually.
Well, the Blackhawk stayed on station. In fact, one thing I've never known is what was the purpose of y'all, if there's going to be a ground convoy for the exfil, what was the purpose of y'all remaining on station like you did?
So we kept 2 attack little birds and 2 Blackhawks over the target for fire support. So
Okay.
the little birds, they've got miniguns and rockets,
Right.
and they're going to be slightly further out in terms of their restricted fire areas. Where the Blackhawks were being used, and honestly, hindsight being 2020, it wasn't a great way to do this, and it's not being done anymore, at least not in urban environments. They were being used as for both the miniguns, which I don't think they used the miniguns a lot, but they had snipers on board. So it's a great stable platform for the shooter, but it's a 50-something foot long target for people on the ground that have weapons. Mm-hmm. And you can't fly fast, because if you're flying fast, your shooter can't hit anything. So the speed is less than what you would fly if you were, just trying to avoid fire. We're probably flying 50 knots, right? Which may seem fast to someone on the ground, but that's really slow for an aircraft. Mm-hmm. And it makes the aircraft much more vulnerable to ground fire.
And how far above ground were you?
Very low. I mean,
Okay.
the Blackhawks had to stay 150 feet and below.
Okay.
And the little birds, I think, were 300 feet and above, which worked out great. I mean, we'd done it, at that point, probably 50 times counting rehearsals, and never had any close calls in terms of mid-airs.
Were you just flying racetracks?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we had, when I was in Baghdad in 2004, I can remember being on a cordon and search mission in Sadr City area, and they had changed all the TTPs because the racetracks got predictable, apparently, for ground fire, and so they were flying figure eights, and they were also altitude changes, and they had gone through all kinds of machinations to try and make sure the bad guys on the ground didn't have a predictable means of assessing, where the flight was going to be.
Right. Now, my flight, because I'm not one of these 4 aircraft over the target. I've already gone in, and I put my guys on the ground. But I took my flight north of the city for exactly what you're talking about. And one of the guys criticized me. He said, "Hey, we need to stay closer to the target so we can see what's going on." And I'm like, "No, we're a contingency force at this point. I'm going north of the city where there's no threat, because if we're just doing circles up there, why would I want to be right here in the middle of this fight and put our entire flight at risk?" And it was obviously the right decision to do what I decided to do. So I've got my flight, and I'm north of the city. Now, north of the city is not a long distance. It's probably a mile.
Right.
And we're up there orbiting, basically on standby. I mean, when you got assets like that, if you could keep them on hand as a ground force, keep them on hand, right? Because you never know when you might need some kind of helo support. And then I get called back in when the first Blackhawk gets shot down.
Well, that's what I was going to say. So you were flying what, Super 6-4?
Right.
And Super 6-1, your friend Donovan, right?
Right.
So he's the first one to go down.
And Cliff Walcott.
Yeah, and Cliff Walcott. And then you were, I think you were directed in to replace him.
Correct.
Okay.
Now, we didn't have a sniper on board. So we're going in simply to use our minigun down close to try to provide fire support for the guys on the ground. That's what our mission has now become, which that was not our mission prior to that. But again, you adapt and you do what needs to be done to try to help the force that you're supporting.
And you've got a full crew?
4, yeah. 2 crew chiefs and 2 pilots.
All right, so Super 6-1 is down. What do you remember about Super 6-1, hearing it over the air, and recognizing that one of them's already down?
Yeah, I mean, I've always called myself an eternal optimist. It never in my wildest dreams would I have thought that Cliff and Donovan would be dead. I just assumed that, they took a round, they're going down, they're going to land the aircraft somewhere, we'll get them recovered, and we'll all go debrief this thing when this is over. But obviously now we've lost a bird, which is the first time that this happens for us. There had been another Blackhawk shot down by 10th Mountain Division previously with some fatalities, but it wasn't our unit. And it, I've always used the phrase "big sky, little bullet." You don't think it can necessarily happen to you until there's enough volume of fire where it's going to happen to you. And there's also a search and rescue bird shot down in the middle of all this that then heightens that even more, because now they've shot down 2 aircraft in about 5 minutes, and we're going into this fray. This is getting real, really fast. And I remember telling the crew chiefs, because I've got control of their guns from up front. So I've got an arming switch. And I armed the guns, and I said, okay, you're armed, but we got friendlies all over the ground down here. So we can't go in here just blasting away. When we see bad guys, we got to get situationally aware so we know where all of our forces are before you start launching 6,000 rounds a minute downrange.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, in an urban environment, I don't want to say it's impossible, but right on the rooftops, it's really difficult to sort all that out. Because first of all, they're all taking cover. So, they're not standing out there waving at you. They're all taking cover. So trying to figure out where everybody was would have probably taken us a while. In the end, we only made it around 3 times when we got nailed by an RPG.
So RPG to the tail rotor, right?
Right.
In the movie, and later I want to get your thoughts on the movie, like I said, but in the movie, there's a scene where you took the RPG to the tail rotor, but initially you thought it was going to be okay until you started getting some play in the pedals and stuff like that. So what were your first thoughts, and how did that I mean?
Well, I knew we were hit, and I always tell people, if you want to know what it feels like, drive too fast in a parking lot and hit a speed bump. That's what it felt like. It felt like a jolt to the airframe, because you don't see it. Usually what they were doing is they let us fly by, and then they emerge from the doorway and shoot. So you're probably not going to see the launch. The crew chief might see it, depending if they're looking in the right direction. And then the reason they hit both of us in the tail is they're not leading us enough. So that 50-knot magical speed was just ballistically perfect for them to shoot at I'm sure they were aiming for center mass.
Which the crazy thing is, an RPG is not usually designed to take out aircraft.
No, I mean, but if you fire enough of them, eventually, they say they fired 150 at us on that mission. Now, not just at me, but on that mission. That's how many RPGs.
I never heard that. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, they went all in. They thought, we want to bring down a helicopter, and they were successful. So anyway, back to your question. Initially, I feel like I hit a speed bump, knew we were hit. I can see the airfield. It's 2 miles ahead of us. And looking in the cockpit, everything's okay. Controls were all responding. But what had happened was the gearbox had been blown apart, and it's like a transmission in your car, right? If you blow your transmission apart,
you ain't go anywhere.
Not for very long. Once those
gears
run without oil for any period of time, they're going to self-destruct, and that's what happened. And then when the tail rotor left the aircraft, again, that's impossible to describe. If you haven't experienced it, I can't describe it. I mean, it's just violent spin of the aircraft, out of control.
What do they call that? Counter rotation or something, where you're trying to restore stability?
Well, the tail rotor is there to counter the torque of the main rotor system. Again, if you think about a drill, people are familiar with that. You pull the trigger, you can feel it want to turn. That's torque. So the same thing's happening to a helicopter, obviously with a lot more force. The tail rotor is mounted horizontally to push against that force that's wanting the airframe to spin. Once that tail rotor's gone, there's nothing. So essentially, if you were left unaffected by anything else, what would eventually happen is the airframe, minus wind drag, obviously, would be spinning as fast as the rotor blades are in the opposite direction. Yeah. That's essentially once it reached equilibrium. That will never happen, but that's how much force you're talking about here. And I remember looking at my feet, trying to convince myself, you're doing the right thing in terms of which pedal you're pushing, but it is having no effect on the aircraft. And then I'm like, okay, we lost the tail rotor. Again, this is something you can't train that. There's no, you can't do it in a simulator. I mean, we can do a loss of tail rotor in a simulator, but you can't do the violent effects, the physical violent effects of the airframe in a simulator. But I knew what had happened, and the only thing you can do is shut the engines off, because again, that's what's creating that torque. So if you can remove that force, it'll stop that spin, but now you have no engines. Yeah. So that's not good either, especially at low altitude. But it's what you have to do. You can't possibly maintain control of the aircraft if it's just spinning out of control. So in a Blackhawk, we don't have control of the engines on the flight controls. So the co-pilot or the non-flying pilot has to shut the engines off. So I looked over at Ray and I said, "We lost the tail. We better pull them off." And he knew he was an experienced guy. I actually had more experience than I did, and pulled the engines off. But we're spinning so fast that he said, and we talked about it on the ground afterwards, typical instructor pilots, he said, we're spinning so fast, the centrifugal force was causing him to not be able to lift his arms up over his head, which is where the engine power control levers are. So he got one to idle and got one about halfway off, which slowed the spin but didn't stop it. And now, with no engine power, we're falling out of the sky like a Coke machine. And all I could do is try to keep the aircraft from flipping upside down, which, again, I don't know if anything I did made a difference, honestly, but all I can tell you is we crashed right on the wheels. And that's the only reason I'm still here.
All right, so you're on impact. Now, you said something on the ground. Did Ray make it?
Yeah,
okay.
We all survived the crash.
Okay.
The crew chiefs were hurt really bad because they don't, first of all, they don't have as good as seats, at least in that version of the aircraft. It's been improved since. And they're probably not strapped in, meaning, you know, they operate on what we call monkey harnesses back there.
Yeah.
So they're on a strap, but they're not strapped into their seats, which have, you know,
Yeah.
all of the crash survivability.
I use those as
built
a
in.
jump master in
Yeah.
Blackhawks.
Because it allows you to move around
Yeah.
and do the things you need to do. And, you know, you get in the seat when you have to land. Well, they didn't, you know, obviously we're not planning to land, so they're probably not strapped in, or at least not likely that they're both strapped in. So, you know, that violent crash, they were probably not going to make it. But Ray, I mean, he was not hurt as bad as I was. And we're talking, once I regained consciousness, we're talking about what happened, and there was no reason to talk about what happened. We should have been talking about, hey, the heck, we're going to survive the next 5 minutes here. But we did, you know, and that's when he explained what he had tried to do. And then he was able to get himself out of the cockpit. There's no way I could get out. I had a femur fracture, crushed vertebrae in my spine. It's hard to get out of a Blackhawk cockpit when you're healthy. Mm-hmm. With those injuries, there's no way. So I just thought, I'm just going to fight it out from the cockpit.
I did not recall that your co-pilot had made it, but they didn't survive. Am I correct?
Well, they were killed in a firefight.
Yeah, they're all killed in the firefight. Yeah, I remember that now. All right, you're still stuck in the cockpit. I remember, I'm assuming it was when I read it, that you had a kind of an off the books weapon. Didn't you have an MP5 or something like that? Mm-hmm. Was that standard issue, or was that
for us?
Yeah, was okay.
Yeah, we used the MP5. They don't use it anymore, I don't think. But that was our we had an M9 pistol and an MP5.
So you wound up having to engage targets yourself while you're on the ground in the cockpit?
Actually, not from the cockpit. That's one area where Blackhawk Down deviates from what actually happened. I mean, I did consult a little bit on the movie, but really not much. You know, I guess if they're going to exaggerate something and make you look better than you actually were, that's a good thing. But yeah, they have me, you know, blasting away from the cockpit. It was amazing how quickly Gary Gordon and Randy Sugart got to the cockpit. There were no Somalis there yet. And that's why I hadn't fired any rounds. I had my MP5. I was ready to go, but nobody had showed up. And then all of a sudden, Gary and Randy are standing next to the cockpit. And I'm like, wow, this is over. There's a rescue force here. Which
is an amazing story in itself. I mean, both of them wound up with the Medal of Honor posthumously. But I recall reading that they both requested 7 times to be put on the ground, knowing full well that there was only going to be 2 of them and no telling how long till any guys of the Rangers got there.
You're right about all of that. And again, I only know about it secondhand because obviously I'm not on the aircraft with them. But they were told initially no, and eventually convinced the leadership that if they were not let in, we were lost. And, you know, you don't know what's in the mind of someone else, but they had to know, hey, this is going to be dicey at a minimum, because it took 8 hours for another American to get to our crash site.
Yeah, which is crazy when you think about the fact that as you were going down, you could see the airfield roughly 2 miles away, and yet it took 8 hours for anybody to get there.
And it's because, well, we were resource constrained, and there were so many things happening. You had 6-1's crash site, you had the convoy, you had the target, now you had my crash site. So really, the commander's got 4 things that he's got to deal with, and he didn't even really have the resources for one.
By the way, I'm going to chase a rabbit real quick. I don't know if you heard this yet, but the whole base renaming thing that happened.
I was going to bring this up
about Gary Gordon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a brilliant solution. And when I just
think
read it
is.
a couple days ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. For those who don't know, that Fort Gordon was one of the names that nobody knew was apparently tied to a Confederate. I didn't know that Benning was. I didn't know that Rucker was. I just went and trained there, as I'm sure you probably did. But Fort Gordon got renamed to something, but Fort Gordon's getting its name back for your rescuer, Gary Gordon.
Right.
Yeah. That's I think that's pretty. Now we got to find a Fort Shugart somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. They might have to create one. Yeah.
What do you recall about Shugart and Gordon being on the ground? I mean, I've read their story separately. I've read it in your book, but give me and the listeners, when they got on the ground and were talking, what were your thoughts? What was the conversation?
It was brief, purely mission focused. I mean, there's no doubt about it. They knew, hey, look, we got to get him out of the cockpit, meaning me, because I'm too vulnerable there. I'm sitting up, basically up off the ground, elevated, and so that was one of the primary things they wanted to get done, is get me out of there, and then essentially, as well as they could, set up a perimeter. Now, the way the geography of this crash site was, there was a wall right to the right. The nose is pointing forward as I'm sitting here, and there's a wall right to the right. Now, it's just a corrugated tin wall, basically, but still, there's no way for someone to access the site from there. So I believe their decision was, we're going to go secure the left side, put me on the right, and that is, in fact, where the attack primarily came from, was the left side. So I can hear it, and then I could see Somalis, onesie, twosies. I fired all the rounds in my weapon at the Somalis that tried to come in on the right side, but the bulk of the attack came from the left side.
How long was Shugart and Gordon in the mix? I mean, how long until they were actually taken?
It's hard to say. I know there's an official timeline somewhere. I honestly don't recall. Time is so hard to judge when things are in that state of chaos. I would say probably 10 minutes, maybe 15, from the time they showed up to the side of the aircraft to, Gary went down first, and at that point, Randy's almost out of ammunition already. And he came around and he asked me where the crew chief's weapons were, and I told him, and he went in, grabbed one, and then he gave me what I believe was Gary's weapon, which still had rounds in it, because I had fired all the rounds out of my MP5. And then he went around the nose of the bird. He made a quick radio call, and we were told on the radio that a reaction force was en route. Again, cause for a little bit of optimism here. Yeah. And then he went and made his last stand on the other side.
Were 160th aircraft overhead? I mean, were you getting any kind of air cover at all when you were down?
Well, we're not getting any air cover, but that call that he made that call on what we call the fire net, meaning it's a fire support net. So he's talking to attack little birds probably. And I think I recognize the voice of the guy who answered him that said a reaction force is en route. So they're overhead. But again, you're talking 4 targets here, and the commander's got to put
he's got triage
his assets where they can do the most good. And right now, that's the main target and 6-1, because 6-1 was close to the main target. The convoy's too fluid. It's all over the place. And then we are, unfortunately, just a couple guys that, and I don't criticize or fault him for this. He's resource constrained. He's only got so much he can do. We were kind of left on our own.
Left on your own for how long? Do you recall? I mean, do you have a rough timeline of how long you were there?
Well, when Gary and Randy went down, it's 15 minutes. It's over. They overran the site. Yeah.
Which I'm on the one hand sounds like nothing, but it's also an eternity, I'm sure, when you're in the middle of it.
Yeah.
Let me ask you there, and I'm going to be asking you some questions. Your book is extremely descriptive about some things that happened in those moments immediately after Gary and Randy went down. And you talk about the fact that in the movie it shows it. You're there, you're by yourself. The crowd of Somalis finds you, and then somebody knocks you out. Now, in your book, you talked about it in more detail. They were trying to rip your boots off. And then there's this really odd moment where they were stripping your clothes off, and then they almost felt embarrassed, you said, and they kind of put your clothes back on you. Do you recall that moment?
Absolutely. It was very weird. I mean, they're stripping all my stuff off, and of course, one of the issues here is I've got a compound femur fracture, so when they're trying to get my boot off, my youngest played hockey, and when he was a kid, I always tied his skates and took his skates off. And every time I took his skates off, I thought about them trying to take my boot off.
Wow.
and because you never unlace it enough, right? And it's always going to be hard to get off. And at some point, my femur goes out the backside of my leg. And I believe it was because they were, again, just pulling on it, trying to get that boot off. And obviously going back and forth, and finally it just punches through the back of my leg. That's the only explanation for when that could have happened in my mind. Maybe it happened later, earlier, I'm not sure. But anyhow, I can't feel anything at that point anyway. It's just overwhelming pain across the whole body. And then they're trying to get my survival gear off, and I used to make a joke about this. We didn't have regular survival gear that the regular Army units had. We had, we called it ninja gear, and it had buckles on it that are like a water ski vest, right? You have to squeeze
the Fast-Tex
little
buckles.
tangs together to get it to unbuckle. And I always used to say the Somalis don't water ski. So I actually had to help them get that off because, they're pulling and pulling and pulling. And I'm like, well, all right, I'll just undo the buckle. So I undid the buckle and they got it off. And they got me down to my brown T-shirt, which when you see the interrogation video, you can tell I've still got that on, and my desert tan trousers. Now, they were going for the trousers, but because it's very humid there and we weren't taking a lot of showers, our flight surgeon said, you're probably better off not wearing underwear because it keeps you a little bit drier. So I was not wearing underwear. And they start taking my trousers off. And again, this is the only explanation I can come up with. They realized that I'm about to be naked and changed their mind and stopped. And in the end, it had probably a benefit in that it provided a little bit of protection from the elements for that now open wound I had on my right leg. Otherwise it had been rubbing in the dirt. So again, just a whole bunch of little weird,
crazy
things like
little
that.
surreal moments like that. Yeah. But one of the worst moments, and you said in your book, you actually had told yourself you were never going to tell that story until the book was actually put together later. You decided to do it. But at one point, one of the Somalis clubbed you with something. And later on, you remembered what it was. Do you mind talking about that?
Well, the reason, and here's the rationale. What happened at the crash site was unimaginable. I've been in combat before. I've seen people die before. I've been angry at the enemy before. But I never thought humans could do what they did. And I guess I wanted to protect the families of my comrades from knowing about this. So I sort of watered it down a little bit when I first talked about it, not knowing they're seeing bodies dragged through the streets. I didn't know that. It's on the front page of our newspaper at home. The wife and kids of who we think is not conclusive evidence to indicate that it was one person versus another. There's probably three possibilities. But in their minds, that's dad, or that's my husband. But I didn't know any of that. So I'm sort of trying to keep them from knowing that these horrific things happened. And then I get released and I see all this. Oh my goodness, I didn't realize that this is already all out in the public domain. So that's when I decided, well, there's no harm in me telling what actually happened. And it was interesting to me that nobody had questioned it anyway, because if you got butt stroked, which is what I said was originally happened,
right, with
a rifle butt, hard enough to break your eye socket. I can still feel it right here. My eye socket was broken. My nose was broken, but there's no bruise. You're gonna bruise up if you get hit that hard by a rifle butt, right? And you can see in the interrogation video, there's no bruise.
Right.
But no one ever questioned that. And that's because it wasn't a rifle butt. And the best I can tell, it was a body part. It was very heavy and soft, like flesh. And that's why I always thought, well, it's just probably
like the
arm
or leg
of someone. Yeah. That's the only explanation. But it was, again, hard for me to fathom that these people have turned so much against us. Because you mentioned George Bush earlier.
Yeah.
He visited Somalia before he left office.
Yeah.
And there were parades in the street for our presence there because we had brought stability. We had brought an end to the fighting. We had brought an end to the starvation. And they were big, big fans of the U.S. And here we are 10 months later, and they're doing this to us. I mean, you heard the quote, hearts and minds of the people. You can't lose the hearts and minds of the people any worse than that. I mean, that's as bad as it gets, to go from celebrating the fact that you're here to desecrating the remains of my comrades and cutting people into pieces. I mean, it's just insane.
And desecrating the corpses. I mean, we saw a little bit of that in Baghdad. I mean, I wasn't there. I won't try to portray that I was, but I did have my team sergeant saw the images of, and it was one of his friends from back home hanging from a bridge. There's a different level of depravity, but you witnessed it firsthand, and I got to ask you. So when they clubbed you with the body part, did you know at the time that was what it was, or did you process it and see it later in your mind?
No, I think I suspected that that's what it was, and I can't guarantee 100% that is what it was, but I'm relatively certain that it was. I just remember looking at the guy. I didn't cry out or anything. I just looked at. I probably with. I was incredulous. I just couldn't believe that this could be happening at this point. It's just not something, I guess I grew up watching sort of old school war movies, right, where people still act like humans. They're not at the level that these people were at that point. And I don't know.